I still remember the scent of dry leaves that late autumn afternoon, the way the wind played with my light dress, and how his eyes trembled when he tried to smile. My heart already knew, even before he said a word, that this would be a goodbye, but also a promise. His name was Thomas, though I always called him Tommy. He had light brown hair that turned gold under the sun, and the kindest eyes I had ever seen. He wasn't the type of boy who made grand speeches, but there was a quiet tenderness in the way he looked at me, as if, through his eyes alone, he was saying, "Stay with me." We met when I was 17, and he was 19, at a small church gathering, nothing fancy, just some lights hanging and watery punch. But to me it felt like the world had paused for a few minutes when he asked me to dance. The band played something slightly off-tune, but our steps were perfectly in sync, and by the time the music ended, my life had already changed forever. We dated for almost 2 years before that gray morning in October, when he took me walking in the field behind his family's barn. I already knew something was coming. He was nervous, stumbling over words, holding my hand so tightly it felt like he was afraid I'd slip away and disappear. "They called me, Mary," he said, voice shaking. "I'm shipping out next week, probably to Europe." And then he got down on one knee, with a ring that had no shine, but held all the courage of someone stepping into the unknown. And he asked me to marry him. I cried so hard I couldn't even answer right away, just nodded through tears, laughing and sobbing at the same time. He stood, pulled me into his arms and said he'd come back to me, that this wasn't a goodbye, just a pause, wrapped in a promise. The following days passed as if time itself had grown tired, each second heavier than the last, and I started living for the mail. Every letter that arrived with his name made me feel alive again, like somehow, even across oceans, he could still reach me. Tommy wrote with simple words, but each line was full of soul. He told me about the cold, the roar of planes, the ache of missing me, and always ended with, "It's still you, Mary. It'll always be you." I kept every one of those letters in a wooden box, the same box my mother once used to store her ribbon bows from girlhood. I read and reread each one until I could trace the creases of the paper by heart, until I knew exactly where his handwriting trembled most, maybe from fear, maybe from fatigue, maybe from love. My family tried to distract me, told me to go out, not to stay locked away waiting, but they didn't understand that I wasn't just waiting. I was holding on to a thread, invisible, but strong, and as long as that thread stayed in place, I knew he'd come home. War has no mercy for hearts in love. It's cruel, random, filthy, and yet, in the middle of chaos, there was a boy writing to a girl about the scent of the flowers at home, about the blue dress she wore, about how he dreamed of the day he could call her his wife. In one letter, he told me he dreamed of me walking toward him in white, with the breeze gently lifting my veil, and him standing there, medals on his chest, heart in his hands. And he wrote, "Promise me you won't marry anyone else. Mary, promise you'll wait." As if he didn't already know that promise was made the moment he first looked at me. While everyone else talked about bombs and losses, I talked to God every day, begging him to protect my Tommy, to bring him back whole, with the same sweet eyes, the same arms ready to hold me. And when the letters started coming slower, when the days grew quieter than ever, I knew, deep in my soul, something had changed. But I kept waiting. Asterisk. Some people say waiting is a quiet thing, a passive thing, like standing still in the middle of time. But they don't know what it feels like to wait for someone you love while war swallows the world, one letter at a time. Waiting becomes an ache that never sleeps, a constant pulse under your ribs, a whisper that says, he might be gone, and a louder one that says, no, not yet, not him. The first few months after Tommy left were filled with letters, not regular like clockwork, but steady enough that my hope held firm. Every envelope with his name was a small miracle. His words wrapped around my soul like a shawl on cold mornings. They kept me warm when the world around me felt distant and gray. I read his letters aloud sometimes, just to hear his voice again in my head. Even if it was only imagined, I would sit by the window, tracing the ink with my fingertips, and pretend he was right there, across from me, telling me about the men in his unit, about the mud that seemed to follow them everywhere, about the canned food and the rain, and the prayers whispered before sleep. Sometimes he'd tell me about a dream he had, of us dancing again, or walking hand in hand under the sycamore tree where he first kissed me. But then, something changed. 1 week passed without a letter, then 2, then 3. I told myself the mail was delayed, that maybe they'd been moved, maybe he couldn't write, but deep inside, the fear started to bloom, quiet at first, like a small shadow, then louder, bolder, like a storm knocking on the windows of my mind. I remember walking to the post office every single morning, no matter the weather, rain soaking through my coat, wind burning my cheeks, my boots muddy from the fields. I didn't care, I just needed to be there, just in case today was the day his words would find their way home to me again. The postmaster, Mr. Hargrove, was a kind man, older, with white whiskers and trembling hands. Every time I stepped through the door, he'd look up with the same soft sorrow in his eyes, like he wished he had good news for me. Sometimes he'd shake his head before I even reached the counter, and I'd try to smile, say, maybe tomorrow. Even though my voice was getting thinner with each passing week, I started writing him every day. Even when I got no reply, I told him everything about the chickens on the farm, about my little niece Emma learning to read, about the new blue ribbon I wore in my hair, just in case he remembered how much he liked that color on me. I told him I missed him, that I loved him, that I was still his, always his, and I signed every letter the same way, forever yours, Mary. My mother would watch me from the kitchen window, her hands folded like she was praying without realizing it. And sometimes, late at night, she'd come sit on the edge of my bed, just breathing with me, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. How do you comfort someone who is halfway across the sea, halfway through hope and heartbreak? The silence stretched into months, and people around town started looking at me with pity, like they already knew something I refused to believe. Some even said, gently, that maybe it was time to let go, to move on, that maybe Tommy wouldn't come back, but I couldn't, I wouldn't, because if I let go, then who was I anymore? What was I holding on to if not that promise, if not the echo of his voice saying, "Wait for me, Mary"? One evening, after 6 long months without a word, I walked to the church and sat in the very last pew. The sanctuary was empty except for a few flickering candles, and I wept, not quietly, not with dignity, but with the kind of grief that folds a person in half. I begged God to bring him back, to give me just one letter, one sign, one tiny sliver of peace to hold on to. And then, 3 days later, it came. The envelope was crumpled and stained, the ink smeared in places, the handwriting rougher than before, but it was him, it was my Tommy, and I clutched that letter to my chest like it was made of gold. I didn't even wait to get home. I sat down on the steps outside the post office and opened it right there, tears spilling down my cheeks before I even read the first word. He wrote that he had been injured, nothing fatal, but serious enough that he'd been moved to a hospital for weeks. He'd lost some memory at first, been too weak to write, but he was healing now, and the first thing he asked the nurse for, once he could sit up, was paper and pen. "I'm still yours," he wrote. "I never stopped being yours, and if I survive this war, I'm going to marry you with every scar on my body and every beat left in my heart." I read that letter 100 times that week, slept with it under my pillow, carried it in the pocket of my coat. I'd take it out and run my fingers over the creases, whispering his words under my breath, like a prayer, like a spell. Hope rushed back into me, like breath after drowning. And then, as if God had reopened the heavens, the letters returned, not as frequent, but steady, and each one was stronger, brighter, more determined. He wrote of his plans for our wedding, for the little house he wanted to build near the orchard, for the dog he wanted to raise with me. He said he wanted to name her Lucky, because that's what he felt every time he thought of me. I started sewing again, something I had stopped when the silence grew too heavy. I found some soft ivory fabric and began making a dress. Not a full wedding gown, just a simple one, something soft and lovely, in case he came back and we couldn't wait, in case we got married right away, under the trees or in the chapel, wherever the world gave us a moment to belong to each other again. The dress was never quite finished, because every time I tried to hem it, my hands would shake, like some part of me was afraid to believe fully, but I kept it close, folded neatly in my cedar chest, wrapped in lace and longing. Spring came early that year, and the world turned green again, flowers blooming with reckless abandon, as if the earth itself was trying to make up for all the grief of the months before. And I walked each morning with a lighter step, humming songs I hadn't sung in a year, my eyes scanning the horizon as if he might appear there, walking up the road in uniform, smiling, alive. And still, I waited. It was a Thursday, I remember that clearly, not because anything grand happened at first, but because the sky was that pale kind of blue, almost washed out, like it had been scrubbed clean after a long rain. There was still a little chill in the air, but the kind that carried the scent of something new underneath, something blooming, something about to change. I had just finished folding laundry when I heard the phone ring, and back then, phones didn't ring often. They were like church bells, rare and meaningful. I hurried to answer, my hands still smelling like lavender, soap, and I remember my heart skipping so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest when I heard the voice on the other end. It wasn't Tommy. It was a man with a calm, official tone, someone from the base, I think. He said that Private Thomas Edward Larkin had arrived back on American soil, and that he was recovering well, that he would be coming home within the week, and would I be able to meet him at the station on Saturday morning. I dropped the phone before I even hung up properly. It clattered onto the floor as I fell to my knees, laughing and sobbing, pressing my hands to my mouth as if trying to keep the joy from spilling out too fast. Mama came running, thought something terrible had happened, but when I looked up and said, "He's coming home," she started, crying too, right there on the kitchen tiles with me. That Friday night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with the letter he'd written most recently, reading it over and over. I combed my hair 4 times, changed outfits 6 times, tried on the half-finished dress, and then took it off again, afraid I'd ruin it somehow. I settled on a soft floral dress he used to say made me look like spring. I even tied the blue ribbon in my hair, the one he'd once tucked behind my ear before leaving. The train station was small, just one platform with worn wooden benches and a tin roof that rattled when the wind passed through. But that morning it felt like the grandest place on earth. The air was electric, filled with whispers and movement, mothers clutching photos, wives holding flowers, children bouncing with excitement, old veterans in faded hats standing at attention. I stood near the edge of the platform, my hands trembling inside my gloves, my eyes scanning every window of every car that passed, and then I saw him. At first I wasn't sure it was him. He was thinner, his face was paler, and there was a cane in his right hand. But the moment our eyes met, I knew it was Tommy. It was him, still him, despite the war, despite the scars, despite everything that tried to steal him from me. It was still my Tommy. He stepped down slowly, carefully, and I couldn't wait. I ran. I didn't care about my shoes or the crowd or the tears streaming down my cheeks. I ran straight into his arms, or rather, the one arm he still held steady, and he caught me like I was the only thing in the world he'd come back for. He held me so tight I could feel the beat of his heart against mine, slow and steady and real, and we didn't speak for the first few minutes, just stood there, breathing each other in, as if trying to make up for all the time lost to silence and distance. When he finally pulled back, just a little, he looked at me with that same boyish smile, a little crooked now, a little weathered, and he said, "Told you I'd keep the promise." And I laughed, choked on it really, and whispered, "You took your time." And he said, "Had to make sure I came back whole enough to say the vows out loud." He stayed close that entire day, never more than an arm's length from me. We walked through town slowly, people stopping to shake his hand, to welcome him, to say thank you, but his eyes never really left mine, like he was afraid I'd vanish if he blinked. But at home, Mama had set out all his favorite things, fresh bread, peach preserves, his favorite pie cooling on the windowsill, and while everyone talked around the table, he kept his fingers laced with mine under the cloth, quietly, like a secret, like something sacred. That night, when we were finally alone on the porch, he told me more about the hospital, about the men who didn't make it back, about the dreams he still had at night, dreams that made him wake up sweating, searching for my face in the dark. I held his hand and didn't interrupt, just listened, let him speak, let him grieve, let him begin to heal. "I thought I wouldn't remember your face," he said at one point, his voice barely a whisper. But it was the one thing that never left me, not once, even when I forgot my own name for a while. "I still saw you." I didn't try to hide the tears, they came like rivers, quiet and full of everything I hadn't said, everything I'd carried, and I leaned into him, rested my head on his shoulder, felt the heat of him, the realness, the miracle of his return, and then he reached into his pocket, and I gasped. It was the same ring, the one he had given me before he left. Worn now, scratched a little, but still whole, still his. "I carried this in my boot the whole time," he said, "thought if I kept it close to the ground, to the dirt, it might stay real. It might remind me of where I came from, and who I was coming back to. He slid it onto my finger again, and I swear it fit even better than the first time, like my hand had been shaped by all the waiting, all the prayers, all the nights spent whispering his name to the sky. We didn't plan a big wedding, didn't need one, just him, me, a quiet chapel, and the promise that this time, we were done saying goodbye. The wedding wasn't grand, no golden chandeliers, no long aisles lined with flower petals, no orchestra, just a quiet morning. A small wooden chapel with whitewashed walls, the smell of old hymnals, and the sound of wind brushing against the windows. It was enough, more than enough, because he was there, standing at the front, alive, whole, mine. We didn't send invitations, just word of mouth, a whisper here, a knock on a neighbor's door there, and still, the pews filled with kind eyes, familiar faces, hands that had held us through long months of waiting, women who brought pies when I couldn't speak, men who nodded silently at Tommy in the grocery store, veterans who knew without needing to ask what he had walked through. Mama gave me her lace veil. It smelled like cedar and thyme, like stories passed down in silence, and I wore the simple ivory dress I had stitched months before, thread by thread, tear by tear. It still wasn't finished at the hem, but I left it that way, like a memory stitched into the fabric, like a small echo of all the days I had wondered if he would ever come home. Tommy wore his uniform, pressed and clean, though his boots were scuffed, and there was a softness in the way he moved, one shoulder lower than the other now, his steps slightly uneven, but his eyes, oh his eyes, they held the same fire. The same steadiness that had kept me alive across oceans and silence and nights that felt like drowning. The pastor spoke gently, like he didn't want to scare the moment away, like he knew this wasn't just a wedding, it was a return, a healing, a quiet kind of resurrection. We said our vows with hands trembling, voices cracking, tears falling freely. And when Tommy placed that same worn ring on my finger once again, it felt like closing a circle, like a promise, sealed twice, once in hope, and now in truth. After the ceremony, there was cake and laughter on the church lawn, nothing fancy, just lemonade in glass pitchers, music played on a radio, and people dancing with bare feet in the grass. Someone brought a quilt and spread it under the big oak tree, where Tommy and I sat with plates balanced in our laps. I remember leaning my head on his shoulder, hearing him laugh, feeling the rhythm of his breath as he spoke softly to me. Things like, I missed this, and you smell like sunlight, and I think I could stay here forever. That night, in the quiet of our new room, I helped him unbutton his uniform, slowly, carefully. Every scar a story I would learn with my fingertips. Every mark a piece of the journey that led him back to me. We didn't rush, didn't speak much, just moved, like people who had waited too long to be near each other, people who needed silence more than words. He traced my cheek with the back of his hand and whispered, I dreamed of this so many nights, and it never came close to how it feels to really touch you again. And I just kissed his palm, placed it over my heart, and let the tears fall freely. Because joy can be just as overwhelming as grief, and sometimes it's hard to know the difference. We moved into a small house just past the orchard. A little white cottage with peeling paint, and a porch swing that creaked when the wind got strong. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I filled it with soft linens, yellow curtains, jars of jam, the scent of cinnamon and lavender, and on the wall by the door, I framed his first letter back from the war, the one where he said he was still mine. Tommy found work at the mill, part-time at first, then more as his strength returned. He came home every afternoon with sawdust in his hair, dirt under his nails, and he kissed me like he hadn't seen me in years, even if we had just parted hours earlier. He carried groceries with one arm and jokes in the other, made up silly songs about our neighbor's cat, and called me his Mary like it was a prayer. I started teaching at the church school. Just 2 mornings a week. Mostly reading and singing with the little ones, and I found that my voice, which had once been soft and unsure, grew stronger as the children laughed, as their tiny hands reached for mine, as their sleepy heads leaned against my shoulder during story time. At night, we read aloud to each other, old books, poetry, even recipes, anything just to fill the air with our voices. And when it rained, we lit candles and danced barefoot in the kitchen, slow and close, like the world outside didn't exist. Like we were the only 2 people who had survived something and come out whole on the other side. Not everything was easy. There were nights he woke gasping, heart pounding, eyes wide with memories he couldn't shake, and I would pull him close, wrap my arms around his chest and whisper, "You're home, Tommy, you're safe," over and over, until his breathing slowed, until his grip on my hand softened, and he could rest again. There were days he was quiet, far away, and I learned not to pull him back too quickly, but to wait, to sit beside him in silence until he returned. And when he did, he'd always thank me, like I had saved him all over again. We planted a garden that spring, tomatoes, squash, strawberries, and every morning we watered it together, sometimes not even speaking, just letting the sun warm our faces. And when the first green sprouts appeared, Tommy laughed like a boy, said, "Life's stubborn, isn't it?" And I nodded, thinking yes, love is to dot, and through all of it. That ring stayed on my finger, a little loose some days, a little tight others, but always there, shining, not with gold, but with everything we had been through, everything we had promised, everything we had kept. It's been so many years now, the kind of years that soften memories around the edges, like old photographs that have faded under the sun, but somehow, his face has never faded in my mind, not once, not even in my weakest days. I still remember the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the quiet strength in his voice, the way his hands held mine like they were made just for that. That Tommy and I grew older in that little white cottage, the one past the orchard. We watched the seasons come and go like old friends. The snow would blanket our garden in silence, and then spring would sneak in with color and scent and life again. And through it all, we stayed the same in the ways that mattered. His boots by the door, my teacup always next to his coffee mug, 2 chairs on the porch, side by side, worn down by stories. We never had children, and though it was a quiet sorrow that visited us from time to time, we filled our days with nieces and nephews, with neighbor kids who came by for cookies and advice, with stray cats that Tommy always said he didn't want but fed every single morning. We made our life about presents, about showing up, about holding hands even when there were no words to say. As the years went on, the town changed. New stores opened, the mill closed, our church got painted a brighter white, but our rhythm stayed gentle, steady, like the ticking of the clock on our kitchen wall, the one he fixed after it stopped in '64. Said it reminded him too much of how still the world felt without sound. Tommy liked to fix things. Even when they weren't broken, he'd take apart radios and put them back together just for the joy of it, I think in some way. It helped him feel like he could control what life had tried to take, like if he could make something work again, maybe the parts of him that were still sore could heal too. I found ways to help him through the darker days, the ones that came less often but never fully disappeared. I kept a kettle on the stove and a quilt by the door, and when I saw that faraway look in his eyes, I knew not to ask questions, just to sit close and wait. And when he was ready, sometimes he'd say things in whispers, about men who didn't come home, about sounds that never truly stopped, and I would hold his hand and say, "You came back, and you kept the promise." And that was enough. Sometimes we'd sit out back under the stars, and he'd lean his head against mine and say, "I didn't think I'd live long enough to get old with you." And I'd laugh and say, "I always knew, even when I didn't, even when I had cried myself to sleep alone too many nights to count." I knew that loving him meant choosing to believe. On our 50th anniversary, he surprised me by asking to renew our vows. He stood in the church doorway with a single daisy in his hand, said, "The ring still fits, but I'd like to say it again, just so you never forget." And I said, "I never did, but we went anyway." And he said the words with the same trembling voice, the same steady gaze, and I felt 17 again. All over he wore the same uniform that day, a little tighter around the waist, a little looser in the shoulders, but still proud, still him. And I wore a soft blue dress with a ribbon in my hair. And the whole town came to see us stand in front of God once more and say what we had already proven 1,000 times over, with every dish washed, every ache shared, every silent moment filled with presence. I knew, deep down, that our days were growing shorter, not in any sudden or dramatic way, but in that quiet way that candles burn lower, even when you aren't looking. And then, one morning, he didn't wake up. He had gone in his sleep, his hand still resting near mine, his breathing slow, and then, simply, gone. No pain, no struggle, just peace, and the kind of silence that hurts but also heals. I held his hand for a long time, traced the lines of it like I had done the day he came home from the war, and I whispered, "You kept your promise, Tommy. You came home to me, and I kept mine." I never stopped waiting, even when you were here. I was always waiting for one more day, and you gave me a lifetime. The funeral was quiet, as he would have wanted, no fuss, no long speeches, just stories, the kind that make you laugh through your tears, the kind that make you look up at the sky and say, thank you, because even grief is better than never having known love at all. I buried him with the same ring he gave me before he left for the war, the one that had lived through mud and memory and marriage. And I placed one of his letters in the casket, the one where he said, "It will always be you," because it always was, and still is. Now, I sit by the same window where I once waited for the mail. I drink my tea, and watch the trees change, and sometimes I still hear his voice in the creak of the porch swing, in the hum of the wind, in the stillness of night, and I smile, because I know he's near. The garden still grows, wild and stubborn, like love itself, and sometimes a bluebird lands on the fence post and I think maybe it's him, checking in, making sure I'm all right, reminding me of the boy who danced with me under lantern light and came back from war, just to say I do. And if you ask me now, all these years later, if it was worth the waiting, the worrying, the silence, the nights spent praying into the dark, I will tell you, yes, yes, 1,000 times, because loving Tommy taught me that some promises are stronger than time, than distance, than even death. I am still his Mary, and he is still the boy who kept the promise.